Hi there, my name is Terry Eibel, and welcome to the Animation Industry Podcast. This chat includes a little bit of a history lesson about the origins of modern day stop motion. If you're a stop motion enthusiast, you may be familiar with the Puppetoons, which are some of the first stop motion productions in commercial and narrative film dating back to the 30s and 40s. The Puppetoons were originally created by Goerge Pal, who is also known for his later influential work in science fiction film, including films like War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. So in this episode, I'm chatting with Arnold Lebovit, who is the leading authority on Goerge Pal and his work on the Puppetoons. In our chat, he gives an amazingly insightful history lesson about how Goerge created the Puppetoons and brought them to the big screen. And if you haven't seen a Puppetoon yet, please go Google them right now. It will boggle your mind how amazingly meticulously they are crafted and executed. In fact, some of the Puppetoons remain my favorite stop motions of all time, including the one called Tubby the Tuba. So make sure you look that one up especially. Now, the reason I'm chatting with Arnie about all this today is because of his upcoming release of the Puppetoons Movie Volume 2, which you can pre-order right now, and which is a compilation of many of Goerge Pal's productions, including some films which haven't been seen since they were originally in cinemas in the 1940s. So he's going to chat all about the lengths he had to go to compile this film. And besides having a huge love for toys, animation, and the Puppetoon movies, Arnie is a producer himself, starting out first as a film editor in New York and then later moving to LA. Some of his notable works include the films Penny Lane, Rascal Dazzle, and the 2002 remake of The Time Machine. Now, let's jump into the chat. Hello, Arnie. Thanks. Thank you so much for coming on the chat. How are you doing?
Doing great. Great to be here, Terry.
I'm doing good too. What's keeping you entertained during quarantine these days?
I'm thinking about you in the Great White North. I'm thinking about what it's like. I'm thinking it would be nice. Maybe I should be in the Great White North, out of the Great White South, or that's probably what it is.
Well, I'm in Toronto, so it's pretty south of the Great White North. It's not. I mean, it's quite beautiful, right? It's summer right now, so but winter's approaching soon enough. But let's talk more about the Puppetoons and Goerge Pal, because that's what we're here to do. So. There are really three main things that I want to cover today. It's kind of the rich history of Puppetoons and stop motion, where that started and how Goerge Pal kind of created that. And then moving on to your connection to Goerge Pal, and then talking about the Puppetoons. And, you've already put out one volume and now you're working on the second. I want to talk about how you're producing that. So let's jump into Goerge Pal. But first, what exactly is a Puppetoon for somebody who doesn't know what that is? It sounds like kind of a funny word.
Well, Goerge came up with the idea of, it's a contraction of the word puppet and cartoon. I mean, basically. So Puppetoon. That was sort of the idea. And it was sort of his original idea, original concept. And what is a Puppetoon? Well, a Puppetoon is a stop motion animated short subject that was made from the 1930s, late 1940s by Pal. And he created a very interesting technique, something that he did, and there's a story behind it. I can go through the history of that if people are interested. But the idea was he created thousands of hand puppets that were, some were carved and some were lathed in machines. And each puppet was replaced for every frame of film. It's sort of an astonishing concept that today we would think is, almost impossible to imagine. But at that time, they didn't have the technology we had today. So literally thousands of these wood puppets would be created, and every frame they would be replaced with a different head, a leg, a body part. And there were 15,000 frames of film, and maybe anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 puppets in the early days.
So back in the early days of animation, Goerge Pal created this technique, which essentially is kind of what Leica and other studios are doing today with 3D printing, where they're replacing the faces in stop motion. But at the time, I guess there was nothing like this around. So he essentially invented the technique where to make a puppet walk, he created, I don't know, like 50, maybe not for a simple walk cycle, maybe like 20 different individually carved puppets that all look the same, just with their legs and arms swinging. and then replace them. And then that was stop motion back then.
That was the way it was done. It was, well, he was, George, really, I get the way the story goes, and I should backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, George was born in 1908 in Belgrade, Hungary, and he was born to an actor's family. And as he got older, he eventually went. You know, he was always very keen on technical things, very interested in hands-on craft. He actually wanted to be an architect, and he studied to be an architect at the Budapest Academy of Arts. But there was a bit of a slump going on at the time in Hungary, and there was no, as he said, there was nothing to build. So he became a cartoonist. He did animated drawings for news articles and for publications, and eventually it led into animation. He was very interested in animation. He used to watch Oswald the Rabbit and Felix the Cat cartoons in movie theaters. This was back in the 1920s. And he had a really keen interest in it, and he was a bit self-taught in the way that he did it. He had a little advice from a couple of people, but he really just learned it on, basically by doing. He was very, very smart in that respect. And so by the time he was about, in his 20s, he was about 20, 21 years old, he was in a studio in Hungary, Hunia Studios, and eventually he went to Germany and became the head of the animation film department of the UFA studio in Germany, which was the largest film studio in Europe at the time. And he became the head of the animation department. He was only 21 years old. So he was obviously a prodigy. And the way the story goes, he said he was drawing. Most of the work they did was hand-drawn animation, cell animation. And the way George described it, he said he was so bored doing drawings that it just happened about that time he was playing around with three-dimensional objects. In this case, cigarettes. He was doing a commercial for the Overstolz company in Germany. And he was animating cigarettes, but he's, like he said, he was so bored drawing cigarettes, he called the sponsor and he said, "What do you think if I use your own cigarettes? We'll put the trademark on every cigarette. You'll see it on every frame." And a commercial sponsor loved it. And so he started to animate cigarettes to music. And he had them marching and various things. He was very famous for marching, things that marched. And he eventually he put heads on them, the cigarettes, mouths so they could talk, legs so they could walk. Basically put the flat cartoon into 3D. And that was his really big idea for this.
I think it's hilarious that the head animator of the biggest studio got bored animating. And then instead of creating wire armatures potentially for these cigarettes, he instead went to carving thousands of replacement parts for these cigarettes. So this is quite interesting because, while Disney and Fleischer are battling it out, there's Goerge Pal creating this unique technique in Europe. How did he go from cigarettes to creating, because he's got hours and hours of footage for cartoons that have been shown, in theaters around the world at the time, and now you're compiling them. So how did he go from creating cigarettes to, narrative storytelling and creating cartoons and such?
Well, at that time, the only opportunity that he had for doing this sort of thing was commercials. And I would say that George was probably responsible for the television commercials that we've seen since the time we've grown up. Certainly for me, since the radio went to television in 1940s to 1950s, many commercials used stop motion animation. In fact, it's a technique that's still used today where commercials sell things using characters. You'll see, over the years, there was the Pillsbury Doughboy, or there was Mr. Peanut, or there was Speedy Alka-Seltzer. Well, George basically invented that idea. He came up with the first use of stop motion animation for commercials. And it was the commercials that he made in Europe that really launched him. And the sponsors loved his commercials. And George, being George, because he was schooled in literature and in fairy tales and well-known literature figures, he wanted to do narrative. He wanted to make them more expansive. So he started to take his commercials and turn them into story films. They started out just commercials, and then he expanded them into these longer story films. And they were shown in movie theaters just like commercials, but instead of the commercial being, say, a minute, they were story films before the movies. They were lasting anywhere from 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes long. And eventually they expanded to become more like short subjects. But the reason they were very well accepted because they were so amazing, they were so entertaining. And the Philips company is the company that really he did that for in Eindhoven, Holland. And it was the Philips company that helped finance a lot of those commercials.
So they were still commercial work, like they were selling a product over the course of 6 minutes in narrative.
That's right, and it was very subtly done, as you'll see in the Puppetoon movie, Puppetoon Movie 2. You know, you'll have a whole story, and you'll have one little moment. Maybe it'll talk about a radio, or you'll see Philips was selling radios and radio tubes for radios, and you'll see the Philips symbol. But it's only for a moment. It's like he created a story around the concept of radio and sound and broadcasting, and he kind of molded these stories around that idea. But they were really still stories, and the commercial plug became a very tiny part of the commercial, almost like a tag, almost. And they just let George do that. I mean, they were so well received. George became known as the Walt Disney of Europe because of what he was doing. And of course, Walt Disney became very aware of George as a result. But that's how it basically happened, doing these story films. And eventually it got the attention of Paramount in the United States. And that's where the story begins for us in this country.
So then he moved to the US and started a completely, like a woodworking shop.
He started a whole another studio. I mean, George had actually, it's a kind of remarkable. He had already done 2 studios. He had been involved at UFA, and then he was in Holland for at least 8 years or so doing animation. He set up the first animation film studio in Europe, hiring 70 to 100 animators, and that lasted for a number of years. But of course, the thing I didn't mention was that the Third Reich was growing, and George had a history of staying one step ahead of Hitler, even in Germany. He was being investigated, and in Germany, when he went to Holland, of course, it took a while for the German regime to become the horror that it became. But eventually, they invaded Holland. And George left by some miracle. He knew, him and Mrs. Pal sort of knew that something was coming. And they left for the United States. They'd always wanted to live in America. And 2 months later, the Nazis invaded Holland. And he came to America. So I wanted to say that it was really because of World War II that sort of pushed him out, because he had a pretty good sixth sense of what was happening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and then he came to, he was touring with New York. He went to New York. He had lectures. He did at Columbia University. He went to Hollywood. His films were shown at the World's Fair. There's a famous Philips broadcast of 1938 was a hit at the San Francisco World's Fair at that time, in 1938. And that got the attention of a lot of the Disney animators, and certainly Walt Disney. And some of the Disney animators that saw it ended up working for George, and they also worked for Disney. And But Paramount became mostly interested, and they offered him a deal to make Paramounts at Paramount. And that is the main body of his work, some of the greatest of the Puppetoons, although the early ones are pretty amazing. But the ones that people seem to know in this country more are the American Puppetoons, which came out during the time of the Fleischer Superman cartoons, the Popeye cartoons, the Betty Boop cartoons, Little Lulu, all that during that period. Some of them were Paramount. That's the time. That's where people really fell in love with the Puppetoons.
So can you give me some of the highlights of the Puppetoons he created during this era? Because from my understanding, they were kind of there weren't really reoccurring series of characters. They were more, independent narratives, one-offs kind of stories type of thing. So can you give me some highlights of some of the shorts he created?
Well, he was trying to hit on a character. Obviously, he was trying to hit on a character that he could sell to the public. The first character he did was called Jim Dandy. Now, in the Puppetoon Movie Volume 2, Jim Dandy is featured in Dipsy Gypsy. And when we eventually do Volume 3, it'll be in Western Days. But Jim Dandy was his star character. And it's a great character. And he did several of those. He also did Punch and Judy. Punch and Judy characters were actually designed by Fred Moore, who was the great Disney animator. And Fred, of course, some of your audience may or may not know, Fred Moore was the animator that created the Seven Dwarfs and Snow White for Disney, the original look of Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and many. He's known as one of the greatest of the character animators at Disney. And he created Punchy and Judy, and he did a couple of those. George did, and then he did. He had several subjects with a character named Rusty, a little boy, and you'll see again in this next release what hasn't been seen before is the Rusty character, more of Jim Dandy, and Punchy and Judy. So subjects that people haven't seen in 90 years, basically, are going to be seen. And also, it should be said that these are, they were restored from the original successive negatives. That is another aspect of it, where we had access to Paramount Pictures for the first time in history to be able to do some of these, to be able to see them.
So in total, how many Puppetoon original shorts did he create?
He did about, all told, between Europe and the United States, I've counted probably close to 60 or 70, but he actually did more than that. He did in the United States, he did about 45. Over there, he did about 20 to 30, over 30. But he also did a lot of subjects we haven't found. He did a lot of animated cartoons. He did a lot of stop motion. Not a lot of things that he did have not been unearthed. I think the war had a lot to do with it, and we've been able to unearth an amazing number of them with the help of many archives. But by and large, I would say if I were to put a number on it, it's very likely that he could have done close to 100 subjects.
Oh wow, that's quite incredible considering how long it takes each one. Can you take me through? So at the peak where he was working at Paramount, how big was the studio? Like how many people were working there?
Well, it was a very diverse group of people, but I would say it was about the same number that he had in Europe. It was a good lot of people. He had 70 in Europe. He probably had at least that many in the United States. A lot of them came over from Europe. A lot of the woodworkers and doll makers that George used in Europe came over. George had invited them to come over. And as Duke Goldstone, one of the directors and supervisors at the studio that was a friend of mine for many years before he passed away, told me that there were many accents spoken there. People from all over the world worked at the Puppetoon studios. George was an employer of all groups of people, different countries, different creeds.
Yeah. You
Which was
mentioned to
very
me
unique.
before that Ray Harryhausen and Willis O'Brien and a few others were kind of got their start there.
Not so much Willis, because Willis O'Brien had did King Kong in 1933. But Ray, Willis worked at the Puppetoon studios. He was there. It was Ray Harryhausen, of course, was young, a lot younger than Willis, and he got his first job working on the Puppetoons. George basically hired a young animator, Ray Harryhausen, and that was his first job in Hollywood, doing Puppetoons. And in this release we were coming out, and in Puppetoon movie as well, a number of the Puppetoons were animated. He was one of the animators on, I'd say, a good half dozen or more Puppetoons, and so he's very well known for that contribution. So you have some, you do have some really key people. There was nobody else doing this. I mean, George was doing something. When he came to Hollywood, the animators, one of the things that I've learned is that George was, he was no threat to the animators, because everyone was doing flat animation. And here George is doing this whole new thing with three-dimensional animation. And it was a revelation for people. And can imagine, certainly in Europe, but in this country, this is 1939, say the Wizard of Oz period, 1940, you had a lot of black and white films, and all of a sudden a Puppetoon comes on, and for the audiences that saw it in 1940, they were astounded by a Puppetoon. They'd never seen three-dimensional figures move before. And when you see them, it's quite extraordinary how beautiful they are. And
even watching them now, I'm still astounded. I like just looking at it, you can tell that there's thousands of hours behind crafting these individual puppets, and the accuracy is quite insane. I don't know how they did it. I'm assuming they're all, a couple inches tall and handcrafted and hand painted. I'm wondering if you can take me kind of, do you know the background of kind of how the process went from nothing to creating a full Puppetoon movie? Like how many people
as much as I can construct, and as much as I've learned from knowing Ray Harryhausen for many years, and Bob Baker, who worked at the Puppetoon studios, and a whole host of people that I met while they were alive. As it's described, the Puppetoon was basically pre-drawn and pre-constructed. What George basically did, he did in his head. He did something quite remarkable. Every frame of film was constructed in George's head. He designed the entire film from beginning to end. And he made these elaborate director's sheets. And on the director's sheets, he would have every move of the puppet, every head move, every eye blink, every smile. Everything was drawn on director's sheets, frame by frame by frame by frame. So you would have hundreds of these sheets, and each sheet would be followed almost by the numbers by the animator. So they could follow George's pre-design to animate.
So he'd say, I don't know, frame 20, replace left arm with number 3 arm or something.
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. I think it's insane, and it is a bit of a genius to be able to do that, to be able to make that kind of an elaborate, organized construction of the concept. And the animators, of course, Gene Warren, who animated for George and later did The Time Machine and Tom Thumb and many of his features, which we can talk about afterwards, later on here, remarked to me that he couldn't believe it, that he couldn't believe the amount of work that George had put into these designs and these boards that they would follow. They'd never seen anything like it before. So that was a big contribution that he made, and that idea of having it all laid out And Phil Kellison, who was an animator at Coast Special Effects, he did a lot of the Pillsbury Doughboys and Speedy Alka-Seltzers. He animated a lot of those in the 50s and 60s. And he told me the idea for George was basically he'd get somebody who really had no experience as an animator, say a young kid, you know, and he had a lot of young animators who maybe didn't know much about animation, and they could follow his director sheets and animate, basically.
So you didn't need any training. You just pull somebody off the street and say, follow these numbers, and then you have a feature film.
Then you have a movie. I mean, how unbelievable is that?
It's pretty crazy.
It's a little crazy.
So I'm curious.
To be able to devise it in your mind.
Yeah. And
when you see the films, of course, they have a tremendous amount of humor and subtlety, and there's a style, very stylish, particularly the early ones in Europe. They have a wonderful style and movement and fluidity to them and characterization to them that it's remarkable, really, that all of that mind went right into the carving of those individual heads and body parts. You know, it's really quite extraordinary. And it wasn't easy, by the way, for the craftsmen. Yeah. And the craftsmen were not just, it was hard. I mean, I've read a lot of the stories of some of the original animators that worked for George, and I mean, they said sometimes they wanted to throw something at the wall, you know, or you know, because it was so difficult to do. It wasn't easy to do.
Well, was he pretty strict on how exact things had to be? Because the minute differences could change a whole scene or how a puppet.
It could. Plus, he was inventing it as he was doing it, and but knowing George, as I met him and knew him later briefly, and Mrs. Pal for many years, George had a wonderful personality. He had a wonderful, sweet, easygoing quality. He had a wonderful, humorous quality to him. He always laughed. He let things slide off. You know, he had just a wonderful way about him. I mean, to be able to do what he did, his personality is what really pushed through a great deal, and everyone loved him. So while it must have been difficult, George would have had a way of smoothing it over in such a way so they didn't feel so bad, and plus he could do it himself. Yeah. You know, it wasn't like Walt Disney, who certainly had great talent, but he didn't do all the animation. He had a lot of people working for him. George did everything himself. He could do the animation, the direction, the producing, the storyboards. He drew. He was an artist. He could do everything. He could do any aspect of the film. So I think they respected him much more, because if they had a problem, he could go in and actually fix it himself. He could do the actual work.
Yeah.
So that made a difference.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if somebody's listening, they haven't seen the Puppetoons, something you said really stuck out to me. It was how stylized things are, because that's always, I mean, I saw them as a kid and have watched them kind of over the years as they come up. And something that always stuck out to me is how fluid he makes wood seem. Like there's so much squash and stretch and manipulation of volume that you wouldn't expect. There's one scene, I can't think of which one it's from, but it's some trumpeters playing trumpet, and the trumpets, when they, you know, they're just wood, but when they blow the trumpet, it stretches out and then it comes back to their face and squashes in. And the smoothness is incredible. So, I mean, people these days would use 3D printers, but he was having a labor force individually carve wooden blocks to achieve this. It's crazy. So, but that makes me wonder, you know, he's got a whole team of doing like, there's a whole workshop doing kind of heavy labor at some points. How profitable were these things, or where's he generating the revenue from? Was Paramount? So you said they were seeing in theaters. So were people paying to go see Puppetoons themselves, or were they part of like a collaboration of some Fleischer tunes and Disney tunes, or where was the money coming from?
Cartoons, just like Disney cartoons, like Mickey Mouse cartoons or Popeye. They were. Remember, this was the 1930s and 40s when you went to a movie theater, you saw a cartoon, you saw a short subject. They had a newsreel, Pathé News. You saw the news of the day. It was like a TV broadcast. You'd see the news, you'd see a cartoon. There'd be promotional things they would do in a theater. So it would be part of the package.
Gotcha.
And that was part of what the studios financed. They financed an entertaining program when you went to a theater. And the Puppetoon was one of many short subjects that were created. There were many short subjects that were made, thousands and thousands of them, of all sorts, not just animation, but live action as well. If you watch TCM, you can see a lot of them. They show quite a few of them on TCM from MGM. So the financing, I know today it would be quite difficult. The cost of a Puppetoon at that time started in the range of maybe $25,000.
Is that
in 1940?
Is that 1940s money or today's money?
1940s money. Eventually, they kind of moved up to close to 30 or 40 or more $1,000 as time went on. Obviously, today to do a Puppetoon, based on my own experience, which I didn't have to pay the giant budgets because I had so many contributors. But if you were to do like a Gumby that was in the Puppetoon movie, that sequence that I had, it's many hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I just looked up an inflation calculator. So it says $25,000 in 1940 US dollars is today worth $462,680.36. So say the average one was, how long was the average one? Like maybe
anywhere from the original Puppetoons in Europe, because those were sponsored finance, but the Puppetoons in America were roughly about 8 minute, 7-8 minute subjects. And that's what they took about 6 to 8 months to do. There would be, as they said, there'd be 15,000 frames of film, a 1 frame shot at a time. And remember, this was the time of Technicolor.
Yeah.
And George, of course, shot these in Technicolor. After Disney, Walt had the rights to Technicolor originally, so he had the exclusive. And then that moved on, and George was able to use Technicolor in America, but he was actually doing it in Europe with a process called Gasper Color, which was the forerunner of Technicolor. So he was doing Technicolor cartoons in Europe the same time that Disney was doing Snow White in America. So he was doing it well ahead of time. Gasper Color was the forerunner of Technicolor. But in any case, what is Technicolor? Well, it's 3 frames of film. And if a lot of your listeners might know from maybe some of the feature films, like say I'm using The Wizard of Oz as an example, they would have these huge cameras, huge body cameras, and there would be 3 strips of film running simultaneously in that camera. And one would be a red strip, there would be a blue strip, there would be a green strip, and that's somewhat how it was done. A lot of it was done with black and white strips of film that were then dyed. They put dye on those films. So they changed over the years, but what George did is he did a 3-strip process when he did Technicolor. So to complicate things even more, you're shooting, let's say you're shooting 15,000 frames for a 6-minute subject. Each frame is replaced 1 frame at a time with a different puppet. Technicolor required a tremendous amount of light because it was not, these film stock at that time was not like as sensitive as it is today. So you had these incredible arc lights. I'm sure you've seen history of classic cinema where out, you know, in location, you see these giant arc lights that had to light up the sets because the film was not as sensitive as it became over the years. So you have a lot of light, and also to expose it, each frame of film had to be exposed for a full minute. To get the full exposure, every frame was a full minute for red, a full minute for green,
oh my goodness,
and a full minute for blue.
How could he go from drawing frame by frame animation, be bored with that, and then go to this process that he wanted to do? It's insane.
I know. I wonder. So, I mean, he thought that was bored. I mean, this is outrageous. 3 minutes to do a single. 3 minutes to do a single frame of film, and then you have to replace it every frame.
Yeah.
And that doesn't include the building of the puppets, the construction of it, the concept of it, the special effects involved, the editing, the music, the set construction, the marketing. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
I'm still trying to figure out how you said he only produced one every 6 to 8 months and it cost almost $500,000. That I can't imagine a single studio picking that kind of job up now, saying we're going to produce 20 minutes of film a year. They must have been shown on repeat, I guess, everywhere. So I'm wondering maybe what happened to Puppetoons. You know, they kind of fizzled out after a while. So what's the story with that?
Well, I think you touched on it. I mean,
it just cost too much.
It was the economics, and I think the economics just didn't allow for it. It became cost prohibitive, for obvious reasons. Everything we've described. Over the years, the puppets, you started to make less puppets. They weren't quite as extreme, and it kind of moved. You got more economical as you went through time. He had to. Tubby the Tuba was one of the later ones, which is still a fantastic.
That's one of my favorite cartoons of all time from when I was a kid. I still have his song playing in my head occasionally every once in a while.
It really is it's a remarkably wonderful subject. I knew Paul Tripp, who wrote the lyrics. I didn't know George Kleisinger, who wrote the music. He has passed away, but Paul was still alive when I did the Puppetoon movie. He was the sweetest, most wonderful guy in the world. He wrote the whole story and lyrics for Tubby, and he of course let me use it. And he said if it wasn't for Tubby, I mean, he said Goerge Pal gave him his big break in his life. And of course that story repeats over and over again, which we can elaborate, is how many people were influenced, worked for George, or led to other careers because of the things that Pal did. But you mentioned, going back to the stopping of the Puppetoons, I think George wanted to do features. Even back in the 1940s, George always wanted to make feature films. You could see it in the movies he was doing, the storytelling. He was a narrative guy. He knew that. So he was developing a feature film called Tom Thumb back in the 1940s. And he had storyboards he did for it. I had copies of the storyboards. Duke let me look at it. I filmed some of them for the documentary I made a few years ago called The Fantasy Film Worlds of Goerge Pal. And he tried to sell it, but he had Peggy Lee involved. He had a lot of people working on it at the time that later ended up doing the feature film, but it was a live action film with Russ Tamblyn. But he started out doing it as a fully all animated Puppetoon Tom Thumb.
Oh my gosh.
So when the time came that obviously the economics weren't there, George had the expression. He said he wanted to take off his short pants and put on his long pants, features. So he kind of made a way of transitioning from the short to the feature. And then of course, history was made when George decided to go from cartoons, Puppetoons, to features. And what happened to George? He became the father of the modern science fiction and fantasy film, and actually created the industry we have today. Is the most famous and the most well-loved is science fiction and fantasy. And what did George do? He made the War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide. He basically changed the whole course of the movie industry. Starting out with little Puppetoons and animation, he went to future worlds, very much like Walt Disney did with audio animatronics. He created a whole new industry, and that's part of the epic story of Goerge Pal.
Yeah, and a lot of special effects in those movies go directly back to stop motion. So I'm sure he had a play in special effects at the time too. So that was an incredible kind of almost history lesson of where kind of stop motion came from. And it's not a very popularized one. I haven't really heard the whole thing before talking to you. So I'm very appreciative that we've met. I'm wondering, you've mentioned that you had direct connections with a lot of these people, and I'm wondering where your story comes into play through all this. How did you meet Goerge Pal and all that happen?
Well, for me, it was for my connection is the same as millions of others, really. I was a fan. I grew up in the 1950s. I lived in Miami, and it was in 1959, even before, but I'll start with what the most important was. I think it was 1959, 1960, the Time Machine came out. And for me, the Time Machine was life-changing. It was done in such a beautiful, subtle, this is the original now.
Yeah.
It was done in such a beautiful way. It had a subtlety to it that just stood out. When you saw it as a kid, as I did at 9 years old, it struck you, and it did for so many people. But so did When Worlds Collide, and so did War of the Worlds for those people that were 8 and 9 years old when they grew up. He appealed to a young mind. George appealed to a young mind. So that's where it started for me. And I followed George's movies. I saw them all during that period when I was growing up. And I never dreamed that I would actually end up meeting George. I was doing a feature film. I was developing a feature in 1978, 79. It was a sort of a Ray Harryhausen monster stop motion animation movie.
Was this on your own?
Excuse me?
Was this on your own? You just?
I was doing it on my own. I was developing it. I had storyboards done by the same people that worked on Alien. Ron Cobb, who he did original designs for me. I had input from Dan O'Bannon, who was a friend who wrote Alien.
How did you get these connections?
Well, I was in Hollywood. I was there, and you know that when you're living there, sometimes you make connections, or people say, you know, you should talk to this person or that person. Dan O'Bannon was really a door opener for me. Dan said, you know, he loved the idea of my movie, and Dan said, you know, you really should talk to Goerge Pal, because George and Dan had already worked with John Carpenter on Dark Star. And it was a lucky break, and I became very close to Dan, and so I ended up being introduced to George, and I met him at his house in Beverly Hills, and I brought the project to him, and I showed it to him, and of course, that was a day I'll never forget. You know, I was sitting in his living room, and right on his coffee table was the Gail Hickman book on Goerge Pal had come out, and War of the Worlds is right there. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, I'm here in this living room with this guy, and I see the Academy Awards on the wall, and you know, he's got the Academy Awards, and he's got Puppetoons in different places. I didn't know every bit of history at that point, but it was a lot for me. It was overkill, really. And I was just sitting there, and then he comes in, and George was he was the sweetest man you've ever met. He was so charming. He had this wonderful Hungarian charm. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was very disarmed you right away with his personality and his charming nature. And there's no way that you wouldn't love this man. He just had that quality about him where you fell in love with him. It was just pure. It was like magnetism, at least for me.
Well, he invited you to his living room without knowing you were seeing your film or anything. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was such serendipity. And then I stayed in touch with him for the better part of a year. He only lived another year or so. And he passed away January 1980, approximately. I think it was that time. My father died just about the same time as he died.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a great time for me. It was like my father, and then it was Goerge Pal. And because I had been in touch with him, and also was in touch with Mrs. Pal quite a bit. I called her and I said, we introduced, we talked. I said, we really should do something for George. We should really do some sort of a tribute to him. And that was the beginning of the journey that changed my life.
Yeah.
By coming up with the idea of, we really should do something. It wasn't 3 or 4 years later that I made the fantasy film worlds of Goerge Pal, which is really the greater of the projects, that covers his entire life, everyone he knew that was alive, every star that Goerge worked with, Heston, Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh, Ray Harryhausen, has 30 or more people in it, from all the people he worked with in his life. That was the most important project for me in my life.
Wow.
At that time, and then while I was with Mrs. Powell during that period, I was going through a lot of the artifacts that she had in the house. You know, she gave me free reign of everything. She was, I have to say, if it wasn't for Joka, that was her Hungarian first name, stands for Elizabeth. If it wasn't for Joka, nothing of this would have been possible. She really opened the doors for me in Hollywood. I have to frankly say.
That's quite incredible. And they sound like a really great couple to kind of invite you in and allow you to do this. I'm wondering, can you take me back? What did he think of your film in the living room?
Well, he liked it. He liked it very much. He was impressed by the ambitiousness of what I was trying to do. Probably from his perspective, he knew how difficult it was going to be for me to do it. I ended up not being able to make it.
Yeah.
I couldn't quite get all the financing together. I had Dave Allen. Dave Allen was going to do the animation, who has passed away. He did a film. They're working on actually a revival of one of his films called Primevals. I think Goerge liked it very much. It wasn't him. It wasn't for Goerge ultimately. He was a original thinker, and he liked to do things that no one had done before. And he liked to do the one. And he was often asked, you know, why don't you do Star Wars? Why don't you do Close Encounters? Why don't you, you know, they would, at that time, those were the big films that were coming out. But Goerge said that's already been made. See, from his point of view, Star Wars is made.
Yeah.
You're not going to do another Star Wars or a repeat of it. Goerge came up with his own original ideas. No one had done those films before in his life. No one had made those types of films when Goerge did them. He invented those ideas, and he was an inventor of ideas, original ideas. We don't have that today. There's very few people that can be, that you can say is an original thinker, who's an Einstein or a Beethoven. Goerge was like an Einstein, a Beethoven. He was an original thinker with original ideas that no one had ever done before. So I can understand that. He wouldn't want to do something that was sort of like something else, see. And his movies were like that. I mean, when Destination Moon was made in 1950, not only was it the first Technicolor science fiction movie, no one had ever made a space film before. Goerge was the first person to ever make a movie about going into space in 1950, and it was a story about man going to the moon 25 years before we ever landed on the moon. And in the movie, it's very reminiscent of actually Neil Armstrong's take possession of the moon for all mankind. Well, it's that exact line is in Destination Moon. So you know Neil Armstrong saw it.
Yeah.
It comes from Destination Moon. He created that idea of going to the moon and landing there and coming back. So his movies were not just movies. They were visionary movies. They were movies of the future. Goerge was a futurist. And Gene Roddenberry, who was also a friend who created Star Trek, he remarked about that. Goerge and Gene were very close friends, and Goerge was a futurist, and just like Gene was with Star Trek, and so Goerge's Puppetoons, going back to them, represent a landmark in terms of their existence and what they are and what they represent in the history of cinema, and how they influenced everything that followed. And each thing that George did influenced the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It was like a ripple effect. Everything he did had great influence in the industry. So I have great reverence for Goerge Pal because of this.
Yeah, so maybe let's go on that note. So you compiled the Puppetoons first volume already, and now you're doing the second volume. Do you want to kind of explain what led to that after doing your first documentary on Goerge Pal? Why you're compiling all his films together and, you know, unearthing this footage that hasn't been seen in almost 100 years for the first time?
When I made the Fantasy Film Worlds, I was in Mrs. Pal's living room, and I mentioned that she had a lot of different artifacts and things I was going through. And in the closet, there was a little box with some 16 millimeter films in them. And I said, well, what's that? She said, I don't know. And so I said, why don't we look at them? So she had a projector. She had an old Bell & Howell 16 millimeter projector. And me being one of those crazy guys, I used to project films on 16 millimeter in my living room. I used to do it for my friends. So I knew how to use the damn thing. Who knew how to thread a 16 millimeter projector? So I took the films out and I put one of them on, and it turned out to be Tubby the Tuba.
Huh.
And it was a 16 millimeter color print of Tubby the Tuba. I'd never seen it in color before. I'd only remember seeing it in black and white when I was growing up. And then I'm watching it for the first time in color in 16 millimeter. And I was like, my jaw was dropping, just like for you, Terry. It was like, I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And I said to Joka, I said, oh, come on. I mean, we've got to preserve these things. I mean, we got to do something. And that was the beginning of the Puppetoon movie. So it was the kind of same conversation doing the documentary. She said, why do you want to do the Puppetoons? I said, they've been done. Nobody wants to see them anymore. Joka's telling me this. And I said, no, I think people would be very interested to see these things. They wouldn't believe it.
Sorry, I just want to say the Tubby the Tuba that I remember, it is in color. It's like he's gold and there's like blue backgrounds and stuff. Does that mean they colored that after the fact for production?
No, it was shown in black and white on television. The only way that people saw Tubby the Tuba was on television. It was syndicated.
Gotcha.
And in syndication, we only had black and white televisions. So we all saw it as kids in black and white. We never saw, none of the Puppetoons were seen in color. They were all seen in black and white, and the prints weren't even that very good, frankly. So then the Puppetoon movie was born. And that was a big process. I had an enormous amount of help from the industry. Everyone in the industry came in and helped me, from Steven Spielberg and Joe Dante and everyone you can think of who loved Goerge Pal helped me with the Puppetoon movie. Joe Clokey, who created Gumby, who told me if it wasn't for the Puppetoons, he never would have created Gumby. It just went on and on and on. And so that became that was back in 1987. That's quite a while ago.
I was wondering if I had seen the film from the Puppetoons itself then.
That's where you saw it. Yeah. You saw it from my revival.
Because that's before I was born in '88, so I was already out before I was born.
Well, I've had this. This is Terry. This has come up before, where young people and students have come to me, and that's where they first saw the Puppetoons, was the Puppetoon movie, yeah. And that was the intent. The intent was to reintroduce the Puppetoons to a new audience. In 1987 would have been still 40 years, 50 years from when they were made. Now it's 100 years. So that was a big deal. That was really a big deal. So now the question you asked me is the real $65,000, $64,000 question, which is why did it take so long? And it took so long because a lot of these films were, first of all, no one even knew they existed. A lot of the films that I was able to do now have just sort of turned up in the past decade or more. Some of these films started turning up in Europe quite remarkably. And I started to discover a few of them. As soon as I heard that, I said, now we got to do something.
So what, some studio, some archive library archive has a copy of some film and they somehow get in touch with you because
No, it worked the other way. I happened to
somehow
make
get
a
in
phone
touch.
call. I made a phone call to one of the archives, and I said, I really would like to see if I can get some of these films. I've heard about them, and that's sort of when it happened. Then suddenly the films suddenly existed, and then I led me from one source to another source to another source, and then that's how I started putting it together.
Wow.
The biggest hurdle was the Paramount films. Paramount had lost the rights to the Puppetoons back in the late 50s. When after syndication, they were sold to company, and they sat in one company's vault for decades. And I tried to get them from that company. I even talked to Mrs. Pal about can't we get those released so we could show a lot of these, and they didn't want to. They weren't interested. So it wasn't until recently, only within the past few years, that Paramount got the Puppetoons back through a library deal. And they bought that whole library of films ended up going back to Paramount where they originally were made. And I've been talking to Paramount for a number of years. And I said, I would really like access to those to be able to do it. And lo and behold, miraculously, the chairman of Paramount, who I met or was introduced to through a mutual friend at Turner Classic Movies, because I had done a guest hosting there, Giannopoulos let me do it. So it was only in the past 2 years or less that Paramount films could even be seen, the ones that I'm now showing. They were all in vaults.
What a crazy turn of events, like stuff that's almost 100 years old. Well, not, I'm more like 50, 60 years old. Gets tossed around so much and then comes back full circle. So this is basically, is this your full-time job right now? Just trying to figure this all out?
It pretty much is. I mean, I have other films. I'm doing a remake. Well, you can't see it now. The Time Machine. I did a remake in 2002, of course,
Yeah.
with DreamWorks.
Yeah, we didn't hit on your career journey. Do you want to kind of just give some highlights of what you've done? I guess you're doing that right now.
I went from doing the Goerge Pal tribute films to wanting to do a remake of The Time Machine, and I had the rights from Mrs. Pal, and I basically was able to get a remake made with Warner Brothers and DreamWorks. That was in 2002. That became a pretty much it's become a bit of a cult film now. It had Guy Pearce and Jeremy Irons, had a wonderful score by Klaus Badalt. And now, most recently, we're going to do another Time Machine. Andy Muschietti, who directed it, is going to be the director. And so I'm working on another machination, basically. And there's some other projects I'm working on to try to get going, other feature films, other ideas. But my labor of love has really been the Puppetoon 2 and now Puppetoon 3. And that's basically, I'm very happy to say that Puppetoon 2 is going to be released in December. And I'm doing pre-ordering now. It's puppetoon.net, puppetoon.net. You can go there and you can pre-order the film now, and it'll be ready in December.
Nice. Can you give me some kind of interesting tidbits or highlights from what we might see that hasn't been seen since it was originally seen back in the day?
Oh my.
Like was there anything that stood out to you? Like any really neat shots or complicated?
Oh my God. It's there's so much I don't even know where to begin.
Oh no.
There's so much. I'd say that one of the films that I discovered that had never been seen before that I was aware of was Alibaba and the 40 Thieves that George did in 1934. I think it was 34 or 35. And George was trying to make a series of Arabian Nights films when he was still in Europe. And Alibaba was the first one. It was released in France. And it's a 10-minute Alibaba in all stop motion animation. And it's really quite extraordinary stop motion animation. It's mind-boggling when you see it. And you realize how much went into that film. So that's extraordinary. And a lot of the early European films are on there that haven't been seen. Most people have never seen them. And the Paramount films, of course, we have Jim Dandy, Punch and Judy, all with the original titles, beginning and end of some of these gorgeous Technicolor Paramount Puppetoons that when you watch them, you think they were made yesterday. They're so beautiful and they're so gorgeous looking. The colors and the style are striking. Way better than what you saw in the Puppetoon movie that you saw.
Yeah.
The restoration now is years more advanced, and the clarity and the color is incomparable when you see it.
Nice.
So you'll be really impressed when you see it, and all the students of animation will be taking copious notes, believe me, on every short. When they watch it, they will be taking copious notes on how it'll be a revelation for all animation aficionados and students, anyone who's interested in animation. And when they see the Puppetoons, it will be like being reborn for the first time.
Oh, wow. That's quite, that sounds very exciting. I mean, I'm excited to see it. So, you know, we've talked about, you know, the history of Puppetoons, Goerge Pal, your involvement with that, and then now the Puppetoons. Is there anything else you wanted to share?
No, I think, I mean, I'm happy to be doing this now.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be doing it at a time when we all are much closer together than we ever were before because of the pandemic and because of the fact that we're able to have these wonderful, very intimate interactions now with one another. This is a time when something like the Puppetoons, which is nothing but pure joy. You know, to me, they represent just pure joy. That's all they are.
Yeah.
There's nothing topical about it. There's nothing, you know, they just represent wonderness and wonder and boyhood excitement and beauty and color. And now while we're so intimate doing all of this stuff together, this is the perfect time. I think the world needs the Puppetoons.
Yeah.
To go back to that period and to re-experience what those audiences saw in 1940. And as I said, when a Puppetoon came on a movie screen, the audience applauded. When a Puppetoon came on, the audience just applauded. I had stories from parents of parents that have told me it was so extraordinary that the audience was so excited to see something like that. And I guess you're going to get a chance to relive that now. In 2020, we get to see what audiences experienced in 1940. It's really amazing.
Nice. I was going to say, if somebody's listening to this for the first time and just finding out about this, and maybe they're a fan of stop motion, what is the biggest takeaway that you hope they get from our chat? But I think you just said it right there. So for this pre-order, what you're talking about is this a physical DVD copy? Is it a online access? Like what exactly is the pre-order?
No, it's a physical. I want to do a physical product. We're not live on television now, but it's a physical Blu-ray. It looks like this, except it's the Puppetoon Volume 2.
Gotcha.
And you know, and that was important to me. I wanted people to have it in their hands. They could play it on a player. I don't know if people have players. People want to see menus.
Yeah, I'm just checking my laptop. I don't even have a CD player in it.
You have it, so you have to get a burner, you know. But the thing about a Blu-ray is you get a booklet.
Yeah.
There's like there's a 6-page booklet. It's going to look similar to this. That tells you all about the Puppetoons with pictures and descriptions. And the new version, I have copies, but it's not published yet, that people get to have in their hand and they can actually hold it. And the thing about it, it's like going to, it's like you used to go to a library and used to have something that's sort of like a treasure. Yeah. This is like a treasure. It's like something that every animator in the world is going to want to have sitting on their shelf, so they can just pull it off and open it up and be inspired and startled, and every one of them will say, that was an influence in my life. And that's what will happen. Everyone who sees it will say, Goerge Pal, he gave me a little something. Nice. And I think that's the benefit of the whole thing. It's an education. It really is. It's a revelation.
Gotcha. And you can, the pre-orders on puppetoons.net if you're listening. As we wrap it up, is there anything else any final notes you wanted to end on?
No, I'm hoping we'll talk again. I hope that as this comes out, maybe we'll have maybe we can do more Q&A. I'd like to see how your audience.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very exciting to have your audience and animation audiences. I can't wait to hear what they have to say. The reviews. And by the way, you can post reviews on the page that you buy this from. I can't wait to see what people have to say. It's going to be so amazingly joyful to listen to everyone from all over the world comment and respond to these things, and how much, and you should follow that yourself, and you'll see the stories you will start to see will amaze you. Not just the people that don't know Goerge Pal, but the people that do know Goerge Pal, and all the stories that they have in their lives, and they relate everything I said. I'm no different than they are. I'm a fan just like they are. They're going to say the same things, and they're going to say, I was over here and I was there and I remember that and I remember this and it meant something to me here and there and whatever. I have a guy who emailed me just the other day. He said, I was a kid when I was growing up. My brother and I used to act out the characters of the Puppetoons. He played one of them and I played the other one. I mean, these stories come from nowhere, but you're going to hear a lot of wonderful stuff. So that's, I'm hoping we'll talk again, maybe in a few months or whatever, and we'll have more to talk about.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to see. Part of running this podcast is I've learned how connected the animation community is, and somebody, emails me and says, "Oh, hey, I worked with this person," or "I remember that." So yeah, I'm excited to see all the stories and reviews and what comes out of this. So
yeah, I am excited.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on the chat, Arnie. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
It's been great, Terry. I'm looking forward to doing more with you, and good luck with the success you're having with this podcast. I think it's just great.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And if you're listening, and I definitely think you should check out the Puppetoons. If you haven't already, just Google that and watch some videos on YouTube, and go to the website, which is puppetoons.net, and pre-order a copy if you're interested and you still have a DVD player.
And you can have a Blu-ray. It's a Blu-ray and a DVD, so you can have two. I made both. So I made a DVD for those that don't have a Blu-ray. I can't imagine that you don't have one, but you should get the Blu-ray. They're very inexpensive, and you can see it in high definition. But you also have a DVD.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'll include links to those in the description of the chat. So please check them out. And that's all for now. So thanks so much for listening. Okay, bye.